All right, so today we're going to dive into something pretty fascinating. It's this idea of economic freedom and what it means for you, like right here where you live in your community.
Okay.
And to do that, we're going to go old school, back to the 1980s with Milton Friedman.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. His TV series, Free to Choose.
Oh, yeah. I remember that.
Yeah, specifically, we're going to be unpacking the first episode. It's called The Power of the Market.
Okay.
And we're going to look at it with this think and act locally lens.
Think and act locally, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good way to look at it. You know, these ideas, Friedman's ideas about free markets, they might seem a little bit, like a blast from the past.
Yeah.
But they're still surprisingly relevant even decades later. Like, we're going to explore those ideas and how they might, inspire you to do something positive in your own neighborhood.
Right.
Make a difference.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the episode actually starts with Friedman talking about, early America. All these immigrants arriving, with hopes for a better life.
Hope and dreams.
Yeah. And it was this time when there weren't a lot of regulations.
Yeah.
Right? There was this true free market where if you had a good idea and you were willing to work hard, you could really make something of yourself.
Yeah, that's the American dream, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And he actually uses his own family's story as kind of an example of this.
Really?
Yeah. So his mother was an immigrant, and she was able to, get a job and build a life here because of those opportunities.
Oh.
Yeah, and he makes this point that without that open market, who knows what would happen to his family? Their future could have been totally different.
Interesting. So then where does he take us next?
Well, then he fast forwards to 1980s Hong Kong,
Okay.
which he calls a laboratory experiment in, limited government.
I see. Limited government.
Yeah.
Okay.
And free markets, of course.
Okay.
But here's the really interesting part. Hong Kong, at that time, had almost no natural resources.
Right.
Nothing. It was just this, barren rock, basically.
Wow. And yet it's like this economic powerhouse, right?
Exactly. And Friedman says the reason is the power of the free market.
It makes you wonder how.
Right. So think about it. No tariffs on trade, barely any government intervention, and this huge emphasis on people, taking initiative.
So people could basically do what they wanted, start businesses, trade freely.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
And so people in Hong Kong were able to turn this, this barren rock, into this amazing center of commerce, this thriving, innovative place.
I mean, that's incredible. So is that where the think and act locally part comes in?
Yeah, it kind of starts there. It's like, if they can do that in Hong Kong, what could we do right here?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Right. But Friedman doesn't just talk about it. He shows us, takes us right into the heart of Hong Kong.
Really?
Yeah, he shows us people making choices, taking chances. Like, we meet this guy, Mr. Chung, who makes metal containers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and then there's Mr. Yu. He's been making wedding gowns for years.
Wedding gowns. Wow.
But now, times are changing, and he has to adapt his business because the trends are changing.
Oh, so he has to change with the times.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And these are just normal people, right? They're making decisions, they're living their lives, but all these little choices they make, they all contribute to this big, dynamic, constantly changing economic landscape.
I see. It's like a ripple effect almost.
Right, exactly. And what really struck me was, Friedman really emphasizes how free markets actually empower workers.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, he shows these garment workers, they're earning good wages, not because of, government rules or unions, but because companies are competing for their skills.
So it's like the companies need them.
Yeah. So in a way, the workers benefit directly from a competitive market.
I see. But I guess an unregulated market, it's not always perfect, right?
Right. That's a good point. Actually, Friedman does address that. He talks about the whole debate around sweatshops, where conditions might not be great.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that.
Yeah. And he even shows us one of these factories where things aren't ideal, but the workers are choosing to stay there. Why? Because the wages are good.
It's a tough choice, right? But it is a choice.
Exactly. So it raises this question, what role does individual choice play in a free market?
Right. Even if you don't agree with someone's choices, it's still their choice.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about this. Think and act locally.
Oh, yeah.
How do our choices as consumers or workers or even business owners, how do those choices affect our community?
Right. It's like, where do we spend our money? What kind of work do we do?
Exactly. Yeah. And even what kind of business do we choose to start? If we start one, it all contributes to, what our community looks like.
That's true. I never thought about it that way.
Right. And it's not just about these bustling marketplaces and everything. Friedman uses this really interesting analogy to explain the invisible hand of the market.
Okay, what's that?
Well, he talks about a simple pencil.
A
Yeah. And how something as simple as a pencil is actually the result of this massive web of cooperation. We're talking thousands of people all over the world.
For a pencil?
For a pencil.
Mhm.
From the people who harvest the wood, to the miners who extract the graphite, to the factory workers who assemble it, the truck drivers who deliver it, the store owners who sell it. It's crazy.
Wow, I never really thought about it like that.
And the thing is, nobody's telling these people what to do.
So how does it all work?
It's the magic of the market, right? It's supply and demand. It's this invisible hand guiding everything. Prices are like signals. They tell producers what to make, how much to make, and even the best way to make it.
So it's like a self-regulating system.
Exactly. And Friedman's point is that it also promotes, peace and harmony because it forces people to cooperate and depend on each other.
Wow, a pencil can do all that. It's amazing. It makes you think about, everyday objects in a whole new way, like all the things that go into making the stuff we use every day.
Right, exactly. And it goes beyond just economics, too. Friedman really links this idea of the free market to personal liberty, like freedom in general.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah, and he shows this really stark contrast between Hong Kong and China. Like people were risking their lives to cross the border from China into Hong Kong.
Wow, seriously?
Yeah, they were desperate to get there. And it wasn't just about money or jobs. They were looking for freedom. Freedom to live their lives the way they wanted to.
That's really powerful. So it's like economic freedom is tied to personal freedom.
Exactly, that's his point. A society where you can make your own economic choices is more likely to be a society that values freedom in general.
That makes sense. So back to Hong Kong. Was it perfect?
Well, he acknowledges that it's not perfect, no, but it's a pretty amazing example of what economic freedom can do. Like, think about all the refugees that went there.
Yeah.
They came with nothing, often fleeing terrible situations. But they were able to find opportunities in this free market system.
That's amazing.
It is. It gets us back to this think and act locally idea, right? Like, how can we apply that kind of thinking to our own communities? How can we use this idea of individual initiative and economic freedom to make things better?
Yeah, that's a big question. It's not just about individual success, right? It's about how all those individual actions can add up and really benefit the whole community.
Exactly, yeah. It makes you think about how important individual initiative is to everything, like scientific discoveries, charitable organizations, even how languages develop. All of that comes from people acting freely and pursuing their own ideas.
I guess that's true. But what about government? What role does government play in all of this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Because in this episode, Friedman has this big debate with some other guests about the role of government in a free society.
Ah.
Yeah, and that's where we're going to pick up next time.
Welcome back. Picking up where we left off, it's interesting. Friedman is obviously a big advocate for individual freedom and smaller government, but he doesn't stop there. He really digs into who he thinks some of the biggest roadblocks are for free enterprise. And it's not who you might expect.
Okay. Yeah.
He says it's often the industrialists, the big business guys.
Really?
And academics.
Interesting. Why them?
Well, his point is that those groups, they might say they're all about freedom,
Right.
but they don't always mean freedom for everyone. And he thinks industrialists often end up pushing for things that help them, but not necessarily the average person. They might want the government to, I don't know, put tariffs on goods from other countries.
Okay, yeah.
Or give them subsidies, basically special treatment, to give them an advantage.
Right, so it's they want freedom for themselves, but not necessarily for their competitors.
Exactly. And then you have academics. They might push for all these rules and regulations that sound good on paper, but end up actually limiting economic freedom.
In the name of, the greater good or something.
Yeah, something like that. And he uses this example talking about government-funded research. Oh, interesting.
So the idea is that the government should give money to research projects that support minority viewpoints, things that wouldn't normally get funded.
Right.
Sounds pretty democratic, right? But Friedman points out, whoever controls that money, well, they get to decide what gets funded.
So you could end up with the majority actually silencing the minority voices?
Exactly. It's a reminder that government programs, even when they're trying to do good, they can have these unexpected side effects. They can actually limit freedom instead of promoting it.
Wow. That makes you think about who's really in control, right?
Exactly. Power dynamics are everywhere, even in democracies.
Yeah. So where does he go from there?
Well, this whole discussion about, who benefits from what, it leads to this really interesting debate about freedom itself.
Okay.
Like, what does it really mean to be free? Friedman is all about individual rule. He thinks each person should have control over their own life, make their own choices. And that applies to the marketplace and everything else.
Right. The freedom to choose is paramount. Exactly. But not everyone on the show agreed with him.
Oh, really?
Yeah, some of the other guests, they pushed back. They argued that real freedom can't exist without some level of economic equality.
Interesting.
And social justice, too.
Okay, yeah.
Like they were saying, a completely free market, well, that can lead to people getting exploited. They argued that sometimes the government has to step in to protect the people who are most vulnerable.
Right. That makes sense. It's a constant balancing act, isn't it?
It is, and there's no easy answer. Every community has to grapple with it. Like, how do we balance the idea of a free market with the need for responsible government?
Right. How do we create places where everyone has the chance to succeed?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? And it comes up all the time, even in little things.
Like what?
Like, think about the decisions that your local government makes.
Yeah.
Zoning laws, business regulations, social programs, even things like how they decide to build roads and bridges.
Oh, I see.
All of those things, they're about trying to find that balance between letting people do their own thing and making sure that the whole community benefits.
That's true. I hadn't really thought about it that way before.
Yeah, it's everywhere once you start to notice it.
So what does Friedman say about all this?
Well, he argues that in a lot of cases, we've gone too far in the direction of government control.
Of much government.
Too much. He thinks it makes things less efficient and takes away people's choices. He actually brings up Medicare as an example.
Oh, wow.
He says, yeah, Medicare might have helped some people, but it's also come at a cost.
And that cost is?
Well, he says it's mostly being paid by younger generations. They're the ones who will end up footing the bill.
It makes you think about, the long-term effects of all these decisions.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. It's about intergenerational equity. The choices we make today, they affect not just us, but the people who come after us.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So are there any other examples he brings up?
Oh, yeah. One that really caught my attention was this whole discussion about state capitalism.
State capitalism.
Yeah, it was a new one for me, too. Basically, it's this idea that even in countries that say they're capitalist, the government plays a much bigger role in the economy than we might think.
So it's not as simple as just free market versus government control.
Right. It's more complicated than that. And the guest who brings this up, he argues that the U.S. economy, even back then, was already really influenced by the government.
Okay, so what kind of influence are we talking about?
Well, he points to things like corporate taxes, government regulations. He says businesses aren't truly free the way Friedman's talking about.
Interesting. So how does Friedman respond to that?
He doesn't back down. He acknowledges that, yes, some corporations might get some benefits from government policies.
Yeah.
But he says at the end of the day, they still have to compete. They still have to innovate to stay alive. He thinks less government interference would actually lead to more competition, which is good for everyone because it would mean lower prices and more choices for consumers.
So it's kind of like both sides have valid points.
Yeah, it's a complex issue, and it raises some really important questions about how much power corporations have over the government.
Right, and how that power affects the whole idea of a free market. It's something to think about, even at the local level.
Exactly. Like, are there certain businesses in your town that have a lot of sway over local government?
Yeah.
And if so, how does that affect everyone else? It's a reminder that those power dynamics, they exist everywhere.
And that we should be paying attention to them.
Absolutely. It's crucial for people to be aware of what's going on and to, get involved, make their voices heard. We often think of politics as something that's happening far away, but it's happening right here in our own communities.
Yeah, that's a good point. And our choices and our actions, they can actually make a difference.
Right. And that's especially true when it comes to shaping the economy. Like, if we want to see a balance between free markets and responsible government, we have to be informed and engaged. We have to hold both businesses and the government accountable.
Yeah, it's not about blindly picking one side or the other.
Exactly. It's about really thinking about these issues, understanding all the different viewpoints, and then fighting for what's best for our communities. And toward the end of this part of the episode, Friedman says something pretty thought-provoking.
Okay, what is it?
Well, he's actually pretty skeptical about voting as a way to achieve real freedom.
Oh, wow. Why?
He says, in a democracy, you often have to compromise. If your views match up with the majority, then great, you get what you want. But if you're in the minority,
Yeah,
you might end up with policies you don't like.
right. So what's the alternative?
Well, he says, in the marketplace, you get exactly what you vote for with your dollars. Like, if you don't like a company's practices, you can choose not to buy their products.
That's an interesting way to think about it.
It is. And it kind of challenges us to think about how we can make a difference through our individual actions.
Okay, yeah.
Like, voting is important, for sure, but it's not the only way to make a difference. We can also, organize with our neighbors, advocate for specific policies at the local level, or even just choose to support businesses that we believe in.
So it's about recognizing that we have power, even if we're just one person.
Exactly. Our choices matter, our actions have ripple effects, and our voices can be heard, even in a system that can sometimes feel really big and overwhelming.
Okay, so we're back. And for this final part of our deep dive into Milton Friedman's The Power of the Market, I really want to bring it all back to this idea of think and act locally.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about how these big ideas connect to our everyday lives. And Friedman really believed that the free market, even with its flaws, could solve a lot of problems that we often think only the government can fix.
So, like, what kinds of problems are we talking about?
Well, he uses this example of the air conditioning industry.
Okay, interesting. Air conditioning, like, how does that tie in?
So he starts off by saying, look, people wanted cool air, right? It gets hot.
Sure.
And the market responded. It created this whole huge industry to meet that demand. AC units, installation, repairs, the whole thing.
Right, makes sense.
But then as people started to realize that, hey, these air conditioners, they cause pollution.
Yeah.
There were all these calls for the government to step in and regulate the industry.
Right, to try and limit the environmental damage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that, of course, led to this whole other industry focused on environmental protection, new technologies, regulations, enforcement, all that.
Okay, so where's Friedman going with this?
Well, his argument is that the market could have solved the pollution problem on its own without the government having to get involved.
Really? How so?
He says that as people became more aware of the pollution issue and started to care more about the environment, they would have been willing to pay more for air conditioners that were cleaner, that didn't pollute as much.
Okay, yeah.
And that would have given companies a big incentive to innovate, to find ways to make their products more environmentally friendly.
So it's like the consumers would drive the change just by making different choices.
Exactly. It's the power of the market in action. But of course, there's another side to that argument, right? Some people would say that relying on the market to self-correct, it can take too long.
Yeah, that sometimes you need the government to step in and make things happen faster, especially when it comes to things like protecting public health or the environment.
Right. It's a tough question. And it's one that every community has to wrestle with. Like, think about what's happening in your own town or city. Are people pushing for more market-based solutions to problems? Or are they asking for more government involvement?
It's a debate that's happening everywhere. And I think it really highlights how important it is for all of us to be informed, to understand these different perspectives, and to really think about what we believe is the best way to address these challenges.
Absolutely. And Friedman, he also brings up how sometimes technological advancements can actually end up improving the environment, even if they seem to cause problems at first. He uses the example of the automobile.
Oh, interesting. Cars, yeah. Obviously, they contribute to air pollution.
Right. But he points out that cars also replaced something that was way worse, horse-drawn carriages.
Oh, right. I never thought about that.
Back in the day, cities were literally drowning in horse manure. It was a huge environmental problem.
That's true. So in a way, cars actually made things better, at least in that respect.
Exactly. It's a reminder that progress, well, it doesn't always go in a straight line. Sometimes new technologies create new problems, but they can also lead to unexpected solutions.
It's like we have to be open to new possibilities and be willing to adapt as we learn more.
Exactly. And so as we wrap up our deep dive into the power of the market, I think the big question for all of us is, how can we take these ideas and apply them to our own communities?
Yeah, what does think and act locally look like in practice?
Right. Are there opportunities to promote economic freedom and individual initiative right where we live? Are there areas where maybe the government is getting in the way, preventing progress, or limiting choices? And again, it's not about blindly accepting everything Friedman said. It's about thinking critically, having open and honest discussions, and finding solutions that really work for our communities.
So what might that look like? Like, what are some concrete actions people could take?
Well, it could be as simple as supporting local businesses that are creating jobs and opportunities. Or maybe it's getting more involved in local government, advocating for policies that encourage economic growth and empower individuals.
It's about taking those big ideas and putting them into action right here, right now.
Exactly. Because positive change often starts small, right in our own backyards. By understanding the power of free markets and the importance of individual initiative, we can all play a role in building more prosperous and free communities for ourselves and for future generations.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit inspiring. And until next time, remember to think and act locally.